Fort Worth, Texas, February 16th, 1974. Say that date out loud. Let it sit in your chest for a moment. America was a different country then, not just politically, not just culturally, but in its bones, in the way people thought about the world. The Vietnam War was winding down. Watergate was consuming Washington. But in the quiet subdivisions of West Fort Worth, in neighborhoods like the one surrounding Western Hills High School, life still had the texture of innocence. Neighbors knew each other's names. People didn't think twice about leaving their back doors unlocked when they went to bed. A teenager asking to borrow the car for a Valentine's dance wasn't considered anything other than ordinary, wonderful teenage life. Nobody locked their doors. Nobody thought they needed to. That is the first thing you need to understand about the night Carla Walker disappeared. Not just the facts of what happened, but the world it happened in. A world that had no mental model for what was about to occur. A world completely unprepared for the kind of darkness that was already walking among them, living in their neighborhood, sitting in the same pews at church, pumping gas at the same stations, waving hello from across the driveway with a perfectly ordinary smile. The danger wasn't a stranger from far away. The danger had a name. The danger lived 1 mile down the road. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Her name was Carla Walker. She was 17 years old. If you had passed her in the hallway at Western Hills High School in the fall of 1973, you would have noticed her immediately, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because of the quality of her presence. There was a warmth to Carla that people who knew her still struggled to articulate 50 years later. She was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who asked follow-up questions because she actually wanted to know the answer, who laughed easily and meant it every single time. She wanted to be a veterinarian. That detail matters. It tells you something about the shape of who she was, the instinct toward care, toward healing, toward protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves. She was the kind of girl who would have been very good at that job. The kind of person the world needed more of, the kind of person whose absence creates a specific, irreplaceable hole in the fabric of the people around her. On the evening of February 16th, 1974, Carla Walker put on a blue dress, not a fancy gown, not something overwrought, just a simple, beautiful blue dress that caught the light when she moved. Her parents watched her get ready. Her father, Layden Walker, a solid and steady man by all accounts, probably stood in the doorway of her room and felt the particular bittersweet pride that parents feel when they realize their child is turning into a person. Her mother fussed with her hair. The house was warm. Everything smelled like an ordinary evening. That night, Western Hills High School was hosting a Valentine's dance. Rodney McCoy was 18 years old and the starting quarterback for the Western Hills Cougars. Think about what that meant in a Texas high school in 1974. The quarterback wasn't just popular. He was a kind of royalty. He was the boy every father in the stands watched with pride, every coach with careful hope. Rodney had the weight of that expectation on his shoulders, and by all accounts, he carried it well. He was good-looking, well-liked, and genuinely deeply in love with Carla Walker. He bought her a corsage. Think about that. A teenage boy going to a florist before a Valentine's dance, carefully selecting something he thought she'd like, planning how he was going to pin it on without fumbling with the needle while she laughed at him. That is the version of Rodney McCoy that existed before the bowling alley parking lot. That is the boy we need to hold in our minds throughout this story. Because that boy, that uncomplicated, corsage-buying, future-planning boy, was about to be permanently, irreparably changed. They took photographs in the living room before the dance. Layden Walker watched his daughter and her boyfriend pose in the warm light of the family home. Rodney concentrating very hard on the corsage pin, Carla laughing at his concentration, and he had absolutely no reason for alarm. She was going to a school dance with a boy he knew and trusted. She'd be home later. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. The dance was everything. A Valentine's dance in 1974 was supposed to be. The gym transformed into something approximating magic with construction paper hearts and streamers. Slow songs that gave teenagers permission to hold each other close, the particular electricity of being young and in love in a room full of people who understood exactly how you felt. Rodney and Carla danced. They laughed. They existed in that perfect, suspended state that only happens when you're 18 and in love, and have absolutely no idea that the world can end without warning. By around midnight, the dance was winding down. Students were filtering out into the parking lot, loading into cars, making plans for where to go next. Some of Rodney and Carla's friends were heading to the Brunswick Ridgemar Bowl, a bowling alley not far away, just to hang out, just to keep the evening going a little longer. The way teenagers always want to hold on to a good night, to stretch it past its natural ending, because when everything feels this right, going home feels like a small surrender. Carla and Rodney went too. This is where the story changes. This is where the last perfect night ends. Not with anything dramatic, not with any warning, not with any of the cinematic signals that movies use to tell you something terrible is approaching. It ended the way real tragedy always ends. In an ordinary parking lot, after an ordinary decision, at the end of an ordinary night. They never saw it coming. Nobody ever does. It was approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. The dance was over. The bowling alley was closing. Friends were peeling away into the night, headlights sweeping across the parking lot as cars pulled out one by one. Rodney McCoy and Carla Walker were sitting in Rodney's car. Think about what it felt like to be them in that moment. A couple sitting in a parked car after a Valentine's dance, probably talking about nothing in particular. Maybe about their friends, maybe about school, maybe about the future the way teenagers do, carelessly, with no sense that the future is a privilege rather than a guarantee. The heater was probably running, the radio was probably on low. The cold February air pressed against the windows from outside. Fort Worth in February at 1 in the morning is a still place. The cold keeps people indoors. The streets carry almost no traffic. Sound travels differently in that kind of quiet. The distant bark of a dog carries farther than it should. A car door 3 blocks away sounds closer than it is. Rodney and Carla would have been able to hear everything. And for a while, there was nothing to hear. And then there was. The passenger door flew open. In the chaos of what followed, here is what Rodney McCoy would later describe: a shadow filling the doorway. A man, a stranger, materializing from the dark of the parking lot as if he had been standing there waiting, watching, choosing his moment with the patient calculation of a predator, because that is exactly what he had been doing. He had been out there in the dark. He had been watching. He had selected them before Rodney could process what was happening, before his brain could bridge the gap between confusion and understanding. The man was on him. He had a gun, a Ruger .22 caliber pistol, and he used it the way a coward uses a weapon, not to shoot, but to beat. The gun came down on Rodney's head with force that split the world into white light and pain. Once, twice. The blows were disorienting in a way that goes beyond physical injury. A pistol whipping isn't just painful, it's destabilizing in a profound way. Your head is the thing that makes sense of the world, and when it's struck hard, the world stops making sense. Time fragments. Sound distorts. You can't think clearly because the instrument of thinking has just been used as an impact surface. Rodney McCoy was dazed. He was bleeding. He was trying to understand what was happening to him, to Carla, to this night that had been so ordinary and safe just minutes ago. And then came the moment that Rodney McCoy would carry inside his chest for the next 46 years. In the chaos, with blood on his face and his head ringing and his girlfriend screaming next to him, the gunman pointed the Ruger .22 directly at Rodney McCoy and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. 3 times. 3 hollow, mechanical failures. The gun misfired 3 times in a row. Imagine what that sounds like. Not the sound of a gunshot. The sound of a gunshot is terrible enough, but the sound of a gun that was supposed to kill you, trying to kill you, failing 3 times in a row. Each click is its own small eternity. Each click is the sound of your life hanging by a thread of mechanical chance. The difference between 3 misfires and 3 shots, between Rodney McCoy surviving that night and being buried beside Carla Walker, was a tiny mechanical failure in a cheap handgun that repeated itself 3 improbable times. Rodney heard the mechanics of his own near-death. 3 times, a man pointed a loaded gun at an 18-year-old boy's head and pulled the trigger, and 3 times the universe made an arbitrary decision that today was not the day, not for reasons of justice or karma or divine protection, simply because of a firing pin, a primer, some mechanical variable that had nothing to do with who deserved to live and who deserved to die, and Rodney McCoy got to live. He got to live with that. In the screaming and the struggling and the blood and the cold February air, in the darkness of that parking lot, The man dragged Carla Walker out of that car, and in the final moments before the confusion and the concussion and the shock overwhelmed his senses, Rodney heard her voice. "Rodney, go get my dad." Those were the last words Carla Walker ever said to the person who loved her most. Not goodbye. Not a declaration of love or a final tender moment. The last thing she said to Rodney McCoy was a command. A desperate, practical, terrified command to go for help. Because even in the moment of her own abduction, even as she was being dragged away from everything safe, Carla Walker was thinking clearly enough to try to save herself. She had faith that help could come in time. She believed that if Rodney just moved fast enough, if her father just got there in time, that everything could still be okay. That is the most heartbreaking thing about those last words. They weren't a goodbye. They were a plan. A 17-year-old girl being abducted by a violent stranger was still trying to solve the problem. And then she was gone. The attacker's car disappeared into the Fort Worth night, and Rodney McCoy was left alone in the bowling alley parking lot with blood pouring down his face. 3 unspent bullets in a gun he'd never see again. A head full of pain and confusion and shock, and a command to follow. We don't fully know how Rodney managed to drive in the state he was in. A head wound that bleeds is terrifying to see. The scalp is extraordinarily vascular, and even minor cuts produce dramatic amounts of blood. A pistol whipping severe enough to draw blood and cause concussion is not a minor cut. Rodney McCoy was injured, dazed, in shock, almost certainly not fully aware of how badly he was hurt. And he was also 18 years old and had just watched the girl he loved be taken by a man with a gun that had been pointed at his head 3 times. He drove to the Walker house. He pounded on the front door. And when Leighton Walker opened his door in the middle of the night to find his daughter's boyfriend covered in blood on his front porch, Rodney McCoy said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Mr. Walker, they got her." The search began almost immediately. Fort Worth in 1974 didn't have the infrastructure for what we now call an Amber Alert. There was no rapid response kidnapping protocol, no forensic units on standby, no digital network to blast a missing child's photograph across a metropolitan area in seconds. What there was, what has always existed and always will, was a community of people who knew and loved Carla Walker mobilizing in the darkness and the cold, and a father who refused to stop moving. Leighton Walker, the man who had watched his daughter leave the house in a blue dress just hours earlier, the man who had smiled at a corsage photograph in his own living room, went out into those streets with a pistol on his hip. Think about the particular anguish of a father in that position. The searching that has no clear direction, the not knowing which way to walk, which street to drive down, which field to cross, because there is no information, just the vast open geography of Fort Worth, and the knowledge that somewhere in it your daughter is alive or is not, and every minute that passes changes that calculation in a direction you can't bear to think about. Leighton Walker searched with a pistol, because what else do you do when someone has taken your child? You go looking and you go armed. Because whatever you find when you find her, you want to be ready. He searched because stopping felt like giving up, and he wasn't capable of giving up. Not yet, not while there was still a direction to walk. For 3 days, Carla Walker was missing. 3 days is a specific kind of agony. It's long enough to exhaust hope, but not long enough to extinguish it entirely. In those 72 hours, the Walker family existed in a terrible suspended state. Not knowing, always hoping, occasionally allowing themselves to believe she'd been found alive somewhere, that there was an explanation, that she'd come home. Friends came to the house. Fruit appeared on the doorstep the way fruit always appears when a community doesn't know what else to do. Someone always had coffee on. The phone rang constantly. Rodney McCoy was in that space too. Physically recovering from the attack, psychologically shattered, caught between guilt and grief, and a desperate, clinging hope that if he'd driven faster, if he'd done something different, if the gun had fired, or if it hadn't, or if they'd never gone to that bowling alley at all. The particular circular torture of trying to identify the exact moment where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. 3 days. And then Carla Walker was found. Her body was discovered near a culvert close to Benbrook Lake on the outskirts of Fort Worth. The particular geography of that place matters. The flatness of Texas in winter, the scrub brush, the silence. A culvert near a lake in February is one of the loneliest places you can imagine. Exposed, cold, empty. It was not a place anyone was supposed to be. It was specifically chosen because no one would be there. What was done to Carla Walker at that culvert was cruel. The medical examination would later reveal evidence of trauma, of deliberate suffering, of the particular viciousness of a man who had planned this. There was evidence of a morphine injection. Morphine, not a common household substance, not something you stumble across by accident, something you acquire deliberately, something you plan to have, something you bring with you to a parking lot when you've already decided what you're going to do. This was not an impulsive crime. The man who waited in that parking lot had come prepared. He had thought through what he was going to do, and he had made arrangements to do it. He had considered logistics. He had acquired materials. He had chosen his moment, and then he had gone home afterward and lived his life as if none of it had happened. The discovery at the culvert ended the search and began the grief. And grief, in its most brutal form, doesn't arrive the way you expect it to. It doesn't land all at once like a wave and then recede into something manageable. It accumulates. It changes shape. It hides in the spaces between ordinary moments. In the automatic reflex of thinking you should tell someone something before the memory catches up to the present and reminds you that they're gone. Rodney McCoy, in the days after Carla's funeral, couldn't stay away from her house. He slept in her bed. That detail was reported by people who knew him at the time, and it is one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire story. Not because it's unusual, it's profoundly, painfully human, but because of what it tells you about the nature of Rodney's grief and the specific texture of his loss. He wasn't just mourning a girlfriend the way a teenager mourns a breakup or a loss. He was grieving a future that had been physically ripped away from him by a stranger in a parking lot. He was 18 years old, and the girl he loved had been murdered, and the closest he could get to being near her was to lie in her bed, in her room, surrounded by whatever still smelled like her, whatever still felt like she'd just stepped out and might walk back in. He slept in her bed because he couldn't bear to be away from her memory, because the alternative, going home, going back to his own room, going back to a life that was supposed to include her and suddenly didn't, was unbearable. He chose the proximity of her absence over the emptiness of ordinary space without her. Now, the suspect. In 1974, in the immediate aftermath of Carla's murder, Fort Worth police interviewed a man named Glenn McCurley. McCurley's name came up because of the gun, the Ruger .22 that had been used to beat Rodney and then failed to fire 3 times. Investigators traced a connection to McCurley, who owned a Ruger .22 caliber pistol. They brought him in. They talked to him. He took a polygraph test. He passed. He passed the polygraph, and the investigators, working in 1974 with the tools of 1974, without the DNA technology that would not exist for another decade, let him go. Glenn McCurley walked out of that police station. He drove home to his house 1 mile from the Walker family. He went back to his life. And for 46 years, that's exactly what he did. The town turned on Rodney McCoy. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It's a slow accumulation. A whisper here, an averted glance there. A conversation that stops when you walk into a room, a former friend who suddenly seems very busy whenever you call. The specific, suffocating experience of walking into a grocery store and knowing, without anyone saying a word, that people are watching you and have already decided something about you. Rodney McCoy was the one they could see. The attacker was gone. McCurley had passed his polygraph and retreated back into his ordinary life. The monster was invisible, but Rodney was right there. The 18-year-old boy who had been in the car, who had survived, whose girlfriend had not, and in the absence of a villain they could point to, some people in Fort Worth quietly, cruelly, began to point at him. The whispers were specific. They were the kind of whispers that are designed to wound. He didn't fight hard enough. Why didn't he fight back harder? Why did he survive when she didn't? Why did he get to live? I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I want you to understand exactly what Rodney McCoy was being blamed for. He was blamed for surviving a pistol whipping while a gun was fired at his head 3 times. He was blamed for being concussed and dazed while a grown man dragged away his girlfriend. He was blamed for being 18 years old in a situation that a trained police officer with backup might not have handled differently. He was blamed, in the deepest and most poisonous reading of those whispers, simply for being alive when Carla wasn't. There is a specific psychological phenomenon called secondary victimization, the additional harm done to a victim of crime by the response of the community and institutions around them. The police questioning that implies guilt. The neighbors whose sympathy curdles into suspicion. The town that needs a story that makes sense and, lacking the true perpetrator, writes one that uses the person standing in front of them. Rodney McCoy experienced secondary victimization in its most cruel form. He had survived a violent attack, watched his girlfriend be abducted, driven wounded to get help, and cooperated fully with every investigation. And the community's response, or at least a significant part of it, was to wonder if he was responsible. The psychological weight of survivor's guilt is brutal even in cases where there is no external blame, where everyone around the survivor insists they did nothing wrong, where the community rallies around them, where the support is unconditional. Rodney McCoy had none of that. He had survivor's guilt and a community that seemed to confirm his worst fears about himself. He had heard the gun click 3 times. He had lived. She had died. In some part of him, the part that survivor's guilt always finds, always excavates, always makes into a monument, must have asked himself the same question the whispers were asking. Why me? Why not her? That question, in the context of no external support and active community suspicion, is not a question you recover from easily. It is a question that reshapes who you are at a cellular level. It becomes part of the architecture of your identity, the dark room you can never fully leave, the sound you carry inside your chest wherever you go. Fort Worth became impossible. The streets he'd driven with Carla, the school where they'd met, the bowling alley parking lot he could never pass again. Every landmark in the geography of his life was now a landmark in the geography of his grief and guilt and shame. And layered on top of all of it was the poisonous awareness that people who should have been helping him carry it were instead adding to the weight. Rodney McCoy left Fort Worth. He moved to Alaska. Alaska. Think about that choice for a moment. Not a neighboring state, not a few hours' drive away. Alaska, almost 3,000 miles away, accessible by boat or plane. A place where winter lasts 8 months, and the geography is so vast and empty that you can genuinely disappear into the landscape. He chose the farthest point he could reach while still remaining on the same landmass. In Alaska, Rodney McCoy built a life the best he could. He worked. He put one foot in front of the other, day after day, and he kept going. But there is a difference between surviving and living. And Rodney McCoy knew that difference intimately. He knew it the way you only know something that has been carved into you by experience rather than taught to you by instruction. He would later say, "I survived, but I never lived." 5 words that contain the entire interior landscape of 46 years. He breathed, he worked, he aged, he kept going. But the life he was supposed to have, the life that included Carla, or at least the life that existed before that parking lot, before those 3 clicks, before Mr. Tram, Walker, they got her. That life never happened. It was taken from him in a bowling alley parking lot as surely as it was taken from Carla in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. Carla's death was physical and immediate. Rodney's was something else, something that happened slowly, over decades, in a state of isolation he'd chosen because the alternative was to remain in a place that had decided he was guilty of surviving. Something that doesn't have a clean name in medical literature, because we don't have adequate language for what it means to survive an event that kills you anyway. Now let's talk about another person who was shaped by that night. Someone who was 12 years old when it happened, someone who watched his family shatter from the inside of that shattering, who was old enough to understand what he was seeing but young enough that it became the thing he built his entire adult life around. Jim Walker, Carla's younger brother. Jim Walker was 12 years old on February 16, 1974. He was old enough to understand what had happened to his sister, old enough to watch his father go out in the night with a pistol, old enough to understand, in the terrible clarity that childhood sometimes provides, that the world had just revealed itself to be a more dangerous and less fair place than anyone had told him, and young enough that this revelation became the foundational architecture of everything that came after. Jim Walker grew up with one purpose that never wavered, never dimmed, never became abstract or hypothetical the way some childhood convictions do. He wanted to find his sister's killer. He wanted justice, not as a concept, not as a philosophy, but as a specific, concrete, nameable outcome involving a specific person being held accountable for a specific crime. He wanted to become a police officer. He couldn't. His eyesight prevented it. The vision requirements for law enforcement, rigidly applied, kept Jim Walker out of the one profession that felt like his birthright, his purpose, the most logical expression of the thing that drove him. But Jim Walker did not stop. He simply became something else, an unofficial investigator, a keeper of the case, a man who made it his life's work to ensure that his sister's murder was never filed away and forgotten in the growing stack of unsolved homicides that every police department carries. He called detectives. He attended meetings. He tracked developments in forensic technology with the intensity of a man who knew that the key to his sister's case might lie in a technique that hadn't been invented yet. He was a man waiting for science to catch up to justice, and he refused to stop waiting. The Walker family never stopped. That is the thing you have to understand about them. Now I need to tell you about the other life being lived during these 46 years. Glenn McCurley lived 1 mile from the Walker family. 1 mile. He lived 1 mile away from the family whose lives he had destroyed, and he did it for 46 years without consequence. He went to church. He raised a family. He had a son. He attended community events. He was, by all external appearances, a normal man, a neighbor, a churchgoer, a grandfather, someone you'd wave to from across the driveway, someone you'd see at the hardware store and stop to chat with for a few minutes about nothing in particular. He mowed his lawn. He watched football. He got older, while Leighton Walker searched fields with a pistol and never fully recovered from what happened to his daughter, while Jim Walker made phone call after phone call, year after year, refusing to let the case disappear, while Rodney McCoy was in Alaska, surviving without living, carrying 3 hollow clicks inside his chest for 46 years. Glenn McCurley was 1 mile away. He was right there, and the only thing standing between him and accountability was the absence of the right technology at the right moment, and the fact that a polygraph machine in 1974 had cleared him, and everyone had moved on. Think about the specific weight of 46 years. Think about how much life happens in that span. Children born, parents buried, careers built and abandoned, the slow accumulation of ordinary time, measured in seasons and birthdays and holidays and all the small recurring moments that make up a human life. 46 years of all of that, for the Walkers, for Rodney, for Glenn McCurley, all of them aging in the same city, breathing the same air, under the same Texas sky. 46 years of impunity. And then finally it ended. In 2019, a detective named Leah Wagner was assigned to reopen the Carla Walker case. We don't know exactly what combination of circumstances brought her to this specific file among all the cold cases she could have chosen. Perhaps it was the anniversary. Perhaps it was Jim Walker, still pushing after all those years, still calling, still refusing to let his sister become a statistic. Whatever the reason, Leah Wagner opened the Carla Walker file and she started reading. What she found was a case that had been genuinely investigated in 1974. With the tools of 1974, there had been real police work done. Leads had been pursued. Witnesses had been interviewed. Suspects had been identified and polygraphed. The investigators of 1974 had not been lazy or careless. They had been limited by what science could do, by what evidence could prove, by the reality that forensic DNA technology simply did not exist yet, and would not exist for another decade. But Detective Wagner was working in 2018, and in 2019 the tools were different. She looked at the original physical evidence, what had survived after 46 years in storage, and she noticed something. On Carla Walker's clothing, recovered from the culvert near Benbrook Lake in 1974, there was a bra strap that had been preserved as evidence. The question was, had anything preserved itself on that bra strap? Evidence preservation over 4 decades is a complicated and fragile thing. DNA degrades. Samples contaminate. Biological material that was deposited on fabric in 1974 may or may not still contain anything viable 46 years later, depending on how it was stored, how it was handled, the temperature, the humidity, 100 variables that compound over time. The bra strap had survived, but what was on it? Detective Wagner reached out to Othram Inc., a forensic genomics company specializing in exactly the kind of challenge she was facing. They were working at the frontier of what forensic genetics could do in 2019, pushing against boundaries that had previously been considered fixed. And here was the terrifying part, the part that kept everyone awake at night in the weeks leading up to the decision to test. The DNA sample available on the bra strap was tiny, genuinely minute, a barely there trace of biological material that had been sitting in an evidence locker since 1974, and testing the sample meant potentially destroying it. Think about what that decision actually meant. The only physical piece of biological evidence potentially linking a killer to this crime, the last physical thread connecting Glenn McCurley to Carla Walker, might be entirely consumed in the process of testing it. If the technology wasn't able to extract a usable genetic profile from a sample that degraded, the evidence would be gone. Not compromised. Gone. This was 46 years of waiting, of Jim Walker's phone calls, of Rodney surviving without living, of the Walker family refusing to give up, all of it resting on a decision about whether to risk destroying the last remaining physical evidence in the hope that modern science could extract something meaningful from it. They decided to try. Othram scientists went to work on the sample with the full battery of modern forensic genomics techniques. They were looking for a DNA profile that could be run through databases, compared against known samples, built into a genetic family tree that could point, even if it couldn't prove directly, toward a name. And it worked. The sample yielded enough genetic material to build a partial profile, and through the process of forensic genealogy, the same technique that had cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018, investigators began building outward from the DNA, tracing family trees, identifying relatives, narrowing down the pool of potential contributors, branch by branch, generation by generation. The family tree they were building kept pointing in the same direction, toward the same neighborhood, toward the same mile radius, toward a name that had appeared in this case before, briefly, 46 years ago, in a polygraph room, and then disappeared. Glenn McCurley. But a genetic family tree is a direction, not a conviction. It points and suggests and says, look here. To confirm the match, investigators needed a direct DNA sample from McCurley himself. And to get that sample without alerting him, without giving him any reason to believe he was under investigation after 46 years of apparent safety, they needed to wait. Glenn McCurley was now in his 70s. He was still in the Fort Worth area, still living his ordinary life, still completely unaware, as far as anyone could observe, that the walls were finally, slowly, beginning to close. Investigators began surveillance. They watched, they waited, patient and methodical, following McCurley through the rhythms of his daily life, looking for the moment when he would discard something, a cup, a bottle, a straw, anything that would carry his DNA without requiring a warrant and without tipping him off. And then one ordinary day in a McDonald's, Glenn McCurley finished his drink and set the straw down on the table and walked away from it. Investigators retrieved the McDonald's straw. They sent it to the lab, and the DNA from Glenn McCurley's saliva on that straw matched the DNA extracted from the bra strap that had been sitting in an evidence locker since 1974. 46 years, a McDonald's straw. The case was solved in the garbage of a fast food restaurant. Glenn McCurley was arrested in September of 2020, and when it happened, when the handcuffs went on and the charges were filed and it was real, verifiably, legally real, Jim Walker picked up the phone. He called Rodney McCoy. Think about that phone call. Think about Rodney in Alaska, having spent decades building a life out of the wreckage of one night, and his phone ringing and Jim Walker's name on the screen. Think about answering and hearing the voice of Carla's brother say, "We got him, buddy." Rodney McCoy broke down. 46 years of surviving without living. 46 years of 3 clicks in the dark. Of Mr. Walker, they got her. Of whispers in grocery stores and Exile and sleeping in her bed because he couldn't bear to be away from her memory. Of carrying something that was not his fault but that he had carried anyway. Because violence and grief give you things to carry, whether you asked for them or not. All of it in that phone call finally had a destination. They got him. The trial of Glenn McCurley began in August of 2021. He was charged with capital murder, a man in his 70s, a grandfather, a churchgoer, a man who had lived 1 mile from the Walker family for 46 years, was sitting in a Tarrant County courtroom facing accountability for what he had done to a 17-year-old girl in a blue dress on Valentine's Day, 1974. The courtroom was full. After 46 years, the people who had been waiting for this moment had arrived. The Walker family. Friends and classmates and community members who remembered Carla, investigators, journalists, and Rodney McCoy. Rodney McCoy came back to Fort Worth, the man who had fled to Alaska to escape the memories and the whispers. and the weight of surviving. The man who had spent 4.5 decades on the other side of a continent came home. He came back to the city where it happened, to a courtroom where he was going to have to sit in a witness chair and look at the man who had changed his life in that parking lot. He took the stand. Think about what it required of him to do that. To stand up in a public courtroom after 46 years and testify about the worst night of his life. To relive the Valentine's dance and the bowling alley and the passenger door flying open and the gun and the 3 clicks and Rodney, go get my dad. To relive all of it in front of strangers, in front of a jury, in front of the man who had aimed that gun at his head. And then came the evidence that, even in a case already built on extraordinary DNA forensics, managed to shock the courtroom. The gun. The Ruger .22 caliber pistol, the weapon used to beat Rodney McCoy and abduct Carla Walker, and fire 3 times at an 18-year-old's head without discharging. Investigators found it, not in a storage unit, not at the bottom of a river, not buried in a field somewhere on the outskirts of Fort Worth where it would never have been found. In Glenn McCurley's house. Glenn McCurley had kept the gun for 46 years in whatever hiding place he'd chosen. Glenn McCurley had lived with that Ruger .22 in his home. The same gun that had misfired 3 times and left a witness alive. The same gun he could have thrown in the Trinity River on his way home from the culvert in 1974. The same gun that could have been melted, buried, dropped from a bridge, disposed of in 1,000 ways that would have made it disappear forever. He had kept it. We can only speculate about why. Trophy, insurance. The calculus of a man who believed so completely in his own impunity that he saw no reason to eliminate the evidence. Whatever the reason, the gun had been there, inside his house, 1 mile from the Walker family, for 46 years. He had kept it while Leighton Walker searched fields with a pistol, while Jim Walker made phone calls year after year, while Rodney McCoy survived without living in Alaska, while Carla Walker's promise ring sat in an evidence locker and gathered the dust of decades. He had kept it. Now let me tell you about Roddy. Glenn McCurley had a son named Roddy, and when the trial began, Roddy McCurley faced the particular devastating revelation of discovering that the father he knew, the man who raised him, who attended church with him, who was present at the landmarks of his life, was a monster. Roddy McCurley did not know. He had grown up with the version of Glenn McCurley that had been carefully maintained for 46 years, the church-going, family-raising, ordinary version that had looked his neighbors in the eye for decades and given no indication that he carried what he carried. And now the trial was dismantling that version in public, piece by piece, in front of the whole world. Jim Walker, Carla's brother, the 12-year-old boy who had grown into the man who refused to stop pushing for justice, found Roddy McCurley in that courthouse. Jim Walker, whose sister was murdered by Roddy's father, chose to comfort Roddy in the middle of a murder trial while sitting with his own grief and vindication and fury and all the overwhelming, complicated emotions of finally seeing his sister's killer face justice. Jim Walker saw a son learning the worst possible truth about his father, and he moved toward that suffering instead of away from it. He put his hand on Roddy McCurley's shoulder. This is what grace looks like in the real world, not in the abstract, not as a concept. In a Tarrant County courthouse in August 2021, it looked like the murdered girl's brother choosing compassion for the killer's son. It looked like Jim Walker extending humanity to someone who had every reason to be left alone with his devastation. The trial proceeded. The DNA evidence was presented in full. The gun was presented. Rodney McCoy's testimony was on the record. The genealogy work in the McDonald straw and the brace strap and 46 years of the Walker family refusing to give up, all of it was laid before the jury. And Glenn McCurley, looking at the full weight of what had been assembled against him, looking at the DNA in the gun and the testimony of the boy he had tried to kill in a parking lot who was now a man looking him directly in the eyes, changed his plea, guilty. Glenn McCurley, who had passed a polygraph in 1974 and walked out of a police station and lived 1 mile from the family he destroyed for 46 years, who had kept the murder weapon in his house, who had gone to church and raised a family and watched the Walker family grieve from a mile away, looked at all of it and said, guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. He will die there. It is not enough. It is never enough when the currency of justice is a courtroom and the debt is a girl with a corsage and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. It is never enough. but it has his name on it. It is real. It happened. Now I need to tell you about the ring. When Carla Walker was found at the culvert near Benbrook Lake in 1974, investigators recovered evidence from the scene. Among the items cataloged from that terrible place was a ring. A promise ring. Rodney McCoy had given Carla Walker a promise ring. The particular symbol of teenage love and intention, and the future they were planning together. The ring had been at the culvert. It had been logged into evidence, and then, in the way that evidence sometimes gets lost in 46 years of file transfers and department changes and storage transitions, it had disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the case, until Detective Leah Wagner started looking. Detective Wagner found the ring. She found the promise ring that Rodney McCoy had given Carla Walker, lost in a culvert in 1974, sitting in an evidence locker for 46 years, and she returned it to Rodney. She put the ring back in the hands of the boy who had given it. Think about what it meant for Rodney McCoy to hold that ring again, to hold the physical object that had existed between him and Carla, the thing he put on her finger as a symbol of a promise. The thing she'd been wearing when she was taken from him. That ring had been to the place where Carla died. It had been there. It had witnessed something that Rodney had spent 46 years trying to process and survive. And now, it was back in his hands. Detective Wagner, in returning that ring, was doing something that went beyond the procedural. She was completing something, closing something, acknowledging something. She was saying, the promise is seen, the love was real, the girl in the blue dress mattered, the boy who survived the parking lot, who pounded on the door, who drove to Alaska and spent decades carrying something that was not his fault. He matters too. I survived, but I never lived. That was what Rodney McCoy said. But now, with a ring in his hand and a guilty plea on the record and the long silence finally broken, maybe something in that equation shifts. Maybe surviving finally gets to mean something beyond just not dying. Carla Walker deserved to grow up. She deserved to become a veterinarian and to wear that ring and to grow old with the boy who bought her a corsage for a Valentine's dance. She deserved the life that was taken from her in a bowling alley parking lot in 1974, and no amount of justice after the fact gives her that life back. But she was not forgotten. Her brother never stopped fighting. Her boyfriend never stopped carrying her. And a detective, 46 years later, opened a cold case file and decided that Carla Walker deserved more than a box on a shelf. Her name was Carla Walker. She was 17 years old. She wanted to be a veterinarian, and she was loved.